Hello again, dear viewers, and welcome back once again to ForSense. My name is Emilcar, and as you know, I am a dark fantasy and sci-fi author. Originally, I had no intention of making a video about this game, but then the dramas arose when the community manager of 1348 Ex Voto used an attack on the narrative of another medieval game from an independent studio as well, called Knight's Path. Now, the thing is, we didn't want to join that drama and waited for the games to come out so we could play them and critique them from a storytelling perspective. But yesterday, the Ex Voto demo came out, and let me tell you, it's the worst thing I've ever played in my whole life. The matter is that I was simply going to criticize the narrative and story, but to be fair for the game itself, I watched all the videos the studio have uploaded to its official channel, the YouTube channel, and among them was the behind the scenes video. And that's what inspired this review. One of the voice actors, particularly Jennifer English, used the term historically accurate when referring to Aeta's haircut, one of the characters. And by the way, I want to say that the voice actress is a self-insert of the character she portrays in the game, which is insane, but what do you wanna? It's almost Hollywood. Yeah, they have the study in Italy, but you know what I mean. So, based on Jennifer's statements, I said, okay, if you want to talk about historically accurate things, let's do it. First of all, I want to make a clarification. As I have said in previous videos, and of course in the intro of this video, I am an author and a world builder. I study the historical elements I am going to use, even if I am inspired by them to create something fantastic. Sometimes I go to extremes, like traveling to places as far and distant for me as Turkey, for example. I wander not one but twice to learn about Islam, since in that country, mainly in its capital, a large number of Arabs from different countries are concentrated, and therefore different perceptions of the Muslim religion and Islam. And I must say that I did all this to get a better idea of how both people and practitioners perceive the same religion, and how to use these elements to create the religions that dominate one of my literary universe, from one of my no, it's not a book, it's a saga. So yeah. And on another occasion, when I was seeking inspiration for the languages and terms that one of the races in one of my works will use, I used Sumerian English dictionary as a root and inspiration to ensure that the phonetics of all the words used by that race were coherent. So, in conclusion, this is how a world builder should be, at least in my opinion. With that said, let's begin. We'll start with the historical context of the game. It's a story of two lesbians in which one defines herself as a knight and the other is a young woman about to enter a convent. So far, so good. The historical setting where the story takes place is Italy during the Black Death, which began about 1347 but hit Italy hardest in 1348 and 1349. In this period, between 40 and 60% of the population died in just a few months. Although in places like Florence, only one-fifth of the inhabitants survived. Okay, so from the point of view of the dialogue, it felt forced. It was like watching a theater play rather than a game. There were scenes where Bianca, the supposed lover of Aeta, acted as if she were performing in a play. I get that, of course I get that. But the general dialogues between Aeta and Bianca didn't sound much different from a play either, and I couldn't help but compare this material to Miles' dialogues in Clarobscur, Expedition 33. Because the actress who voiced Bianca, Jennifer English, is the same one who voiced Miles, and in Clarobscur the character she portrayed was impeccable, and the difference between one script and the other is noticeable. Back to Ex Voto. As we said before, the story takes place in Italy during the plague, in its darkest period, and that's why the game uses this setting for its Souls-like theme. Is the game historically accurate? Regarding Aeta's haircut, yes, it's accurate for knights because it facilitated combat, it didn't get in the way and prevent grabs. But this was done by men, not women. The latter usually wore their hair long. Now, it's supposed that Aeta is a knight and that's why she has that cut, but there the problem began. Aside from the fact that it was almost impossible for a woman to be a knight, this requires following a specific progression. A knight is dubbed at the age of 21. Aeta is a woman between 14 and 18 years old. To become a knight, you must first be a squire, and before that, a page. Aeta is at the age of a squire, but according to the story, she doesn't serve any knight. Therefore, she could be a page, but the problem is that a page was a noble's son sent to serve a higher ranking noble houses to foster them, which implies raising and educating them while creating political alliance and vassalage. Aeta mentions that she was trained by her father, so she wasn't a page. It's historically incorrect then to call her a knight or an errant knight. The armored arm. This was a distinctive feature of the so-called elite knights or cavalieri d'elite. It was clear that Aeta was not a knight, much less an elite one, so that's another flaw in the setting. And beyond all this, the biggest problem is that these were made to measure or adapted from knights' own armor. Italy, being ravaged by the plague, will have a low population of blacksmiths, much less qualified ones, which will make creating something like that for an orphaned noblewoman practically impossible. Not to mention that the measurement of the type of armor were designed for noblemen 21 years old with developed bodies and greater muscle mass, so the arm diameter was larger. And since the arm was modeled after a man's as a common at the time, it would be longer. Therefore, the joints would align in different zones from Aeta's elbow articulation. And medieval women arms, even among well-fed nobles, which didn't happen at that time due to the plague, were slimmer with less muscle mass and smaller circumferences. A standard male arm would be too big and loose. Loose plates, slipping, chafing on joints in elbow and shoulders, or even the risk of pinching skin or muscle when moving. The combat style. Aeta fights using what would be a 14th century Italian arming sword, 1.5 hands long. This sword used a combat style called armisare or arte dell'armisare, which was developed to be practiced by adult noblemen with a physical structure and muscle mass very different from that of a woman, since the latter, for example, would have problems absorbing the full impact of a blunt weapon. Add to that the fact that the situation of the time would have made it difficult even for a noble to maintain the proper nutrition to get the most out of this style. And while it could be adapted for a woman, Aeta mentioned that her father trained her, that is, a warrior, not a trainer, based on her context. So, he would have trained her just as he remembered being trained. This means a style oriented toward men, not as an instructor would have done with a woman, like in this case. Now, to not just point out the game's errors, but to show how it should have been, we'll correct the type of weapon and combat style. She should have used an Italian falchion, a falchione, or spada falcata or messer. It's lighter, single-edged, focused on quick cuts, chops, rather than thrust bindings, and common among infantry and condottieri in northern southern Italy. It has less mass, implying less impact or collision, with descending and gliding cuts that use leverage and speed, ideal for agile and weakened women. Post 1348, it's accurate as lightweight gear, suitable due to the scarcity of forgers and those weapons. In Game of Thrones, for example, something similar happened with Arya Stark, who wanted to learn to fight like a man, but her father, Ned Stark, convinced her to learn a more graceful style focused on speed. That's why she learned rapier use, or in her particular case, needle. In conclusion, if you want to be historically accurate with a female character skilled with a bladed weapon, it must be something focused on woman's physics and structure, not using equipment and techniques clearly designed for men. Finally, we'll talk about Aeta's situation from the perspective of her as a woman and as a lesbian in 1348 Italy. Let's start by saying that historically a woman could never have been a knight in 1348 Italy, nor anywhere in medieval Catholic Europe, much less an openly masculinized lesbian. Knights were armed noblemen, and women in combat were extremely rare, defensive or legendary exceptions, not the norm. But how were lesbian relationships between women viewed in that context? First, let's analyze the general view of medieval Italy, 14th century. According to the church and canon law dominant in Catholic Italy, lesbian relationships were considered a grave mortal sin, crime against nature, and an unnatural vice. Saint Thomas Aquinas classified them as one of the worst forms of lust, second only to bestiality, because they violated the natural order. Sex was only to be procreation between man and woman. Texts like Decretum Gratiani from 12th century and medieval penitentials imposed harsh penances, 3 years of fasting and prayer for women who rub together. Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century, called them diabolical and most vile. By the 13th, 14th centuries, they were equated with sodomy, punished with excommunication, mutilation, or burning in redivivus or tied to heresy. Now, according to the secular society and laws, lesbian women were less persecuted than men. Male sodomy carried the death penalty in Italian cities from around 1250, with burnings as in Parma in 1287. Why this difference, you may ask? Because of an androcentric view. Without a penis, it wasn't considered real sex, just inferior lust. These relationships were often ignored if kept private, but if they became public, such as involving dildos, cross-dressing, or scandals, they were accused of sodomy, witchcraft, or heresy. Deuteronomy 22:5 prohibits women dressing as men, which Aeta does in the game. In Italy, civil laws involve confiscation of property. Even the Inquisition from 1232 onward could burn them. But during the Black Death, 1348, since like sodomy were blamed for the plague. So, let's see this from a perspective for a lesbian night like Aeta. Female cross-dressing, considered heresy, punished with public humiliation, exile or death, especially for recidivism. It was associated with witches or not women. Now, combine this with lesbianism, explosive. If discovered, the Inquisition will prosecute her as a heretic or sodomite. Burning was probable in 1348 as the plague fueled fanaticism. Now, in summary, lesbians were seen as aberrant, unnatural, and diabolical sinners, but due to their relative invisibility, few were actually burned, unlike men. In 1348 Italy, an openly masculinized lesbian like Aeta would likely last only a few days before facing the stake. Once again, we can define the game as modern fiction, not historically accurate as some try to claim. How the story could have been done correctly? She, the daughter of nobles. From an early age, her parents realized her sexuality, so her father, foreseeing that she could be condemned for her same-sex attractions, secretly trained her in the use of dagger and messer. It's not the most noble weapon, but it's suitable for her physical build. She maintains a relationship with Bianca. One of the local peasants discover them and tell a local noble who has known to have his eyes on Bianca. The noble uses this fact to try to seize Aeta's lands, properties, and wealth inherited from her father. Aeta equips herself with whatever she can find and set out to rescue her beloved Bianca. But after she defeats everyone, including the noble, he tells her she arrived too late. He reveals that, realizing that Bianca preferred women and would never reciprocate his interest, he called the Inquisition under the pretext that Aeta and Bianca were witches and part of the cause of the plague. This would form the second half of the game. Now, Aeta must not only clear her name, but also rescue Bianca, as the Inquisition has taken her for trial and sentencing to the stake. That would be a much better crafted and historically plausible story than Ex Voto. On top of that, Aeta would have been an attractive and feminine woman because, by instruction from both her father and mother, she had to behave in a way that prevented other nobles and villagers from suspecting her lesbian condition. Her parents knew that envy and malice went hand in hand, and any suspicion could trigger grave consequences. Moreover, Bianca would have fallen in love with Aeta precisely because of that femininity and grace. After all, lesbians are women attracted to other women, and many, like men, prefer graceful, delicate, and feminine women, not someone who looks like a man with a vagina. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is good world building. Well, that is for today's episode. I hope you like it. If so, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe, share, and turn on the notification bell. I read your comments and we'll see each other soon. Thanks for your time and see you next time. Bye bye.